Lancaster as well.
I see live. We are
So it looks
live.
like, yeah, looks like we are up and live. So this is episode 1 of the Good Intentions podcast. I am here with Andrea Goulet. Andrea, can you tell the audience, the listeners out there, the viewers even as well, who are you?
A bit about myself?
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, I'm most known for running a company called Corgi Bytes, and we maintain and modernize existing code. And the way I came to that was through meeting a friend at a high school reunion. My background's in marketing and business, and I was a blogger for a number of years. My friend from high school invited me to join his startup, so I did that about 8 years ago. After running the business together for a few years, we fell in love, got married, had a couple of kids, and now I'm running this business. We've got about 12 employees. I am also politically active, so I started, one of my really good friends is run for Congress, so I'm helping her out. And I think the thing that I do is I focus on what I think of as communication infrastructure. So what are all the different ways that you need to a team and making sure that a team can communicate effectively. So building up kind of the systems that need to happen in order for good communication to happen on a team. And that's kind of where my passion is. So
Cool. Yeah. A lot of neat stuff. Yeah. So I invited you.
Yeah, I don't know. I like it. So
yeah, totally. So for a few reasons, right, I wanted to talk to you. One of them being that from my perspective, right, I see you as kind of the master Yoda, right, that's teaching us all about empathy, right? It's something that you emphasize, right? And I think I see you this way, not necessarily because you know everything there is to know, but because you've been emphasizing empathy since before it was cool, right? I think people talk about it a lot now. Right.
Yeah.
And you've been there for ages where other people weren't. And I think that's really cool. And so you've really staked out this position as being, I'll go ahead and say authority, although I think you.
Oh, wow.
So I want to get your reaction to something that I've been thinking about. Right.
Yeah.
So a lot of the time, right, in the world, I see people making accusations of somebody lacks empathy. Right, in response to the way somebody treats somebody or something along those lines, or I hear a third-hand story about some misfortune that somebody suffered, and the other guy in the story, right, who their perspective in the story wasn't necessarily told, but that person lacks empathy, and it seems to me that the declaration of a lack of empathy is not necessarily a lack of empathy itself, but when you make such a declaration, have you stopped to consider the perspective of that other person? Have you exercised your cognitive empathy in coming to that conclusion? React to that, right? Is it a lack of empathy to accuse someone of a lack of empathy?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think that in doing that, it's like I feel like that's kind of a blame tactic, right? So I really like the work of Dr. Brene Brown, right? So I kind of thinking around, some of her research. And so she says that shame is the feeling of unworthiness that we experience from holding of love and belonging. So essentially we all want to feel like we belong, right, to a group, right? And shame then happens, so blame happens as a discharge to try to feel like not feel that shame. So I think what is in my own personal experience, and this is just me, but what I can, I guess, project is that if somebody's accusing somebody of, it can be, yeah, you didn't look at the perspective, but then you're right. I think it's kind of meta, because if you're just blaming somebody else for not having empathy, that's not actually an empathetic response, right? That's not using your, how can I teach this person about empathy while not using blame, right? And I think it's a skill, right? I think it's a skill that you can build. And empathy is, it's developed by learning and developed by, you know, gathering inputs, and it's then enacted by perspective taking. And that's from Indy Young. So when you mention cognitive empathy, so there's kind of two steps to invoking empathy. Like I used to play Magic a lot. And so like whenever I think of different kind of human, like when we were on the Developer on Fire, like you called it human interaction patterns. And I love that. And that's kind of how I'm thinking of it. I'm like, so if I ever want to invoke a human interaction pattern, I think of it kind of like, okay, I'm going to play this Magic card, right? Like I'm going to invoke empathy right now. And so the way you do that, it's kind of a two-step, you know, process. So first you have to make sure that you have inputs. If you don't, you ask questions. So ask questions about that other person's point of view, or, you know, what are the questions that you need in order to be able to take a more comprehensive perspective. And then you can just say, well, from my perspective, it might look like this and this and this. And it's more about engaging in a dialogue rather than name calling or blaming somebody for not having empathy. Because I think that that's a really, and I think you're spot on. So
yeah. So it gets really crazy when I start thinking about, well, if I'm saying that someone is lacking empathy, if they're accusing someone of lacking empathy, then am I not committing that exact same sin?
Yeah, it kind of gets back to the, you know, like he who is sinless cast the first stone kind of thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think empathy, it's the most important thing to remember is that it's a practice, right? And I think, you know, it feels very similar in, you know, well, you're not coding, you know, you don't actually know that, like you're not a real programmer, right? Like, and like I've heard so many things like you're not technical if you use an IDE for development instead of command, right? Like we've got all of these different things like, oh, if you only do HTML and CSS, then you're not a real developer. And so I feel like, you know, now that empathy has kind of become in vogue, it's like people are trying to make themselves feel like they're part of the in-group. And the problem is that with, you know, with this, if you're doing it through a way of blaming other people into the fold, you're excluding them, and that's actually not going to help the situation. What we need to do is teach people who don't feel like they can access empathy, because I think this is a cultural thing that I don't have empathy, which isn't true, right? Yeah. Talking to Marty Lund, who runs a nonprofit called Agile for Autism. I talked to him about empathy, and he said that cognitive empathy is actually how they teach people on the autism spectrum to recognize patterns. And so, you know, the lack there is like, oh, they can't access the feeling state, but they can absolutely have cognitive empathy. You know, it takes them a little bit longer, but it's like, this is something that we can teach. It's a skill that you build. It's like a muscle, right? You have to use it. So it's not a feeling state that you kind of innately have. And I think, you know, learning to code is very much the same way. And so what we need to do is just say, look, we're all practicing all of these skills, and we're all doing the best we can. And I think to your point, getting judgment out of the way is the most important and critical step in that path. Yeah, and just saying, okay, I'm going to listen.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, which is what you're doing with this podcast, which is so awesome.
Totally. That is totally my intent. So I want to just say a couple things about a few things you said. One, you made reference to Developer on Fire, my other podcast, which you were a guest on, and that will be linked in the show notes to our conversation there. And I want to kind of emphasize that this podcast is something completely different, right? It is a non-technical. It is not for programmers. Well, it is for programmers and everyone else, right? So, you know, we talk, you know, here, you know, among two technical people, right? And that's something we talked about on Developer on Fire. That Andrea, you have gone from saying, hey, I'm non-technical, or from being hurt when your husband, friend, business partner, and all of these different things that Scott is to you, said, hey, she's non-technical, in a wonderful blog post that really described that. And you know, in a lot of ways, we commiserated is not the right word, but we shared that we have this journey of me from the I'm technical and not non-technical, and you from the I'm non-technical and not technical, to where now I think both of us can share the same sentiment and say both. right? And so, I mean, your blog post is inspiring to me, but I want to make sure that, an audience that are not programmers, I don't want them to be left out in the cold saying, we're talking about learning to code here, and this doesn't apply to me, right? I mean, we're talking about human skills here, coding being one example of many of the things that we might be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So, we talked briefly before we started recording here about that. One of the things that I wanted to do with this show is to say that we can disagree about things without getting nasty with each other. And I don't even know that I disagree with you on anything, right? I mean, so far we've only talked about things that we agree on, and I don't know that we will get to anything that we disagree on. And I suspect that that knowing who you are, that even if we do disagree with each other on something, we are not going to take that personally. But there's a big problem in the world with that, right? That if, you mentioned being politically interested and even active, right? And boy, this 2016 presidential election was just lunacy, right? And say what you will, I don't even care about the actual content of who was running in the election. The whole concept that you can't be my friend if you are on the other team is, to me, the problem that we are facing in the world today. I think that is the biggest thing. And the whole reason I want to create this podcast is I want to do my part to try to combat that. So I don't know. And the other thing about this podcast is this is not an interview, right? This is a conversation. So I don't necessarily need to ask you a question, so let's just talk.
Yeah, no, look, I was not really politically active before current election, mostly because I felt like there was a lot of bullying. I felt like there was a lot of just like posturing. I felt like there was a lot of punditry. And I didn't think it was dangerous. But with the most recent marketing and journalism, communication, like I've taken whole classes on propaganda. And what I see going on right now is political. It is propaganda. Like it is spinning things in such a way that it is devious and moving towards a specific intent. And to me, that's really scary. And I'm not saying, like the people that are bad people, right? I have family members. Most of my family members voted very differently than I did. We still get together for dinner on Sundays. We still disagree.
Yeah.
What we need more of. Yeah. And what we need, I have not deleted anybody from my Facebook feed, and I have not deleted anybody from my Twitter feed because of my politics. Which my politics aren't really that extreme. I live in Virginia, so one of our senators is Mark Warner, and he calls himself a fierce moderate. And I feel like that's kind of where I am, where I really say, like, look, I'm not going to make a decision until I have the evidence, until I see what's going on. There are places, I own a small business, so there are places where I am way more free market, and there are places where socially I am very progressive, right? And to me, it's about what makes the most common sense for the situation. And in order to do that, we need dialogue. And so I support individual candidates. I struggle to align myself with any political party. And a lot of the people that I like and that I kind of interact with are on that, sometimes they support Republicans, sometimes they support Democrats. And I feel like for the longest time, like I didn't really feel like I had a voice because it felt like there were only two parties. But now everything has gone so far to the extreme that it feels like there's a lot more moderates left. And so now it's like time to step up.
Yeah. I think
I don't know about you, but like, yeah.
So
go ahead.
I think I am pretty politically extreme, and I think that's stating it softly. And but still, these parties that in the U.S. have nothing for me, and they to me, I don't really see much difference between them. But I think you hit on something there about feeling represented, right? You know, the old rallying cry of the American Revolution of no taxation without representation. You know, I look at that and I say, well, we have taxation without representation right now, right? Yes, there are people who call themselves my representatives, right? But Mike Kaufman, who is my representative, has never met me. He doesn't know anything about me. And I don't know under what definition anybody could actually state that he represents me in any way. And me and what, 500,000 of my closest friends, right? I don't know how many people are in my congressional district, but I don't feel like there is any sort of representation at all. And I think generally, I would say that government itself is a net negative, which is one of my unpopular opinions that that I'm afraid to express. And here I am now boldly expressing that, right? Which is, you know, face fears is one of the things I've really tried to express with Developer on Fire and now with Good Intentions. So,
well, I'll mention again, like so when I was talking to Scott on the way over here, I was saying that I was going to do this podcast with you, and he's like, but weren't you just talking to, I was like, yeah, this is a new one that he's doing. And it's like, because he wants to explore kind of the nuance, and his thing is that feminism isn't good. And so he wanted to talk to me about it, because that's really brave and really awesome. So, you know, kudos to you. I think that here's one of the things that I always suggest is that is all we want. We can totally disagree with ideas. Like Scott and I, Scott's more in your camp of just like the government needed, and like, and I have friends who are total anarchists, right? And that's fine. Like, go to the Occupy Wall Street thing. Like, I support you. That's awesome that you can protest, right? You know, when it turns to violence, that's where I'm like, I don't think that's quite, but we have kind of free speech for a reason.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Part of me is like, how can you develop empathy without understanding all of the different viewpoints? So understanding where people are coming from and listening is a really critical part of that. So yeah, I'd love to hear kind of on government and because I'm sure that's going to influence your ideas on feminism as well.
I think there's a lot of reasons why we can have, you know, why there are these camps, right? That allegedly that if you think one thing on one issue, then you might align with somebody on another issue that also thinks that. There's some reason for that, but at the same time, there are. If I agree with somebody on everything, then at least one of us is not thinking, right? So, you know, I think yes, there's probably some intersection in those things, but it's also, there's also not, right? I think both are true and both are false. But yeah, I think, you know, government is, and for the listeners, right? In the conversation leading up to, let's talk about this thing, feminism was one of the things that I mentioned that I have some very unpopular opinions about, and that I don't know exactly what your thoughts are on feminism. I read a fantastic blog post that you wrote about the striking for a day, that, you know, taking part in the women's strike to call attention to all of the goodness that there is from women. And and it was kind of funny too that in that post, right, you painted Scott as being kind of the yogi on the hill that was kind of the feminist leader who you know, is kind of your So
funny because like the feminists, you know, the typical feminists then commented and they're like, you're not a real feminist because you're taking instructions from your husband.
Oh my gosh.
Oh yeah, so it's like you get it from both sides. And I think that's just the blaming, right? Like, who cares? I refused to identify as a feminist for the longest time. I came from a very conservative family, that it was the wife's duty to be submissive. Mom is very, 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 she's awesome, right? Takes care of the family, but always self-sacrifice, right? It's this idea of martyrdom. And I have really struggled with that because that's not me. I love taking care of my family, and I love being independent and sharing my ideas. And so I remember, like, never took any classes on feminism. I had friends who did. I lived in the art section. Like, I was going to business school, but I was hanging out with the art kids because I went to a really good school for fine arts. I went to VCU in Richmond, Virginia Commonwealth University. And so all my friends were artists. And so they were all like protesty. And I was like, look, I'm not a feminist because I really like to shave and I don't really like confrontation. And so when I met Scott, like on one of our first kind of interactions, I was talking about like, no, I'm not a feminist. He goes, why not? I was like, what? How can you be a feminist? You're a guy. He goes, well, it's the idea that men and women should be represented equally and that your voice is just as important as mine. I was like, he goes, you believe that, right? And I was like, well, he goes, because right now there's systemic oppression of women. And when we recognize that, you know, really it's just fixing it, right? So that we have equality. And so Scott really is way more of a feminist than I am. And over time, it's like, oh my God, you're right. And yeah, he was the one who was, because I was like, I don't know, I don't want to do this protest. What do I have to protest about? He goes, I think you should. I think you should just take the day off. And it's been really interesting because explore a lot of the nuance. So one of the things that it's really helped with is, and I described in that blog post, that there's this idea of a mental load. And I hear this a lot, like, oh, well, my wife manages the schedule. Like women tend to dominate the house, right? Yeah. Taking on that role at home, where just like I was mentally keeping track of when have the kids laugh into a doctor's appointment, you know, what's for dinner, you know, are we going to plan this vacation, you know, when's the water bill due, like all of these just tasks that were going on my mind. And the day that I had off, basically Scott said, I'm going to take on all of the tasks. And I had no idea. I had never worked a day without this mental load, ever. And I was more productive then than I ever had been. I was like, is this what it's like to be a dude? Like, it's like where I just don't have to worry about what's for dinner and when are the kids going to be picked up. Like, I just was able to get really deep in my level of focus in a way that I never had. And so now, like, that's created a lot of conversation. Like, there was a good cartoon that was making its way on Facebook that had explained this phenomenon really well that I didn't even know that I was coping with. So then I shared it with Scott and he was like, oh yeah, that's the thing. I was like, so how are we going to fix this? Because this is no longer okay. And so I told him, I said, I can either be the boss at work or I can be the boss at home, but I can't do both.
Yeah. Yeah.
You want me to manage. So
yeah, that's remarkable. I mean, coming to that realization that that you were carrying this load, right? And it wasn't necessarily because of him, but that it was this thing, right? This stress, and where did that come from, right? Whether it's evolutionary and biological that women tend to do this, whether it's cultural and it's something, I don't know the answer to that, but yes, it is an undue burden. So you said a few things there, right? Scott saying that feminism is the notion of women should have equality with men, and your voice should carry equal weight, or that might not be the exact formulation, but something along those lines. And I think who can't get behind that, right? I mean, totally, and I'm on board with that, of course. And so when you say that women should be submissive, right? That this was the attitude of your family in the past, and I think there's something to that, right? That there is a cultural thing in that. I guess to articulate a little bit my position about feminism is that I don't think that's necessarily what feminism is all about, is the idea of equality. And if we're going to say equality, well, we need to define equality as well, right? Because that term could mean a lot of things in a lot of ways. And so I think feminism, right? What I told you before, when I was kind of introducing that, hey, let's do this show, and I have these unpopular opinions, and among them are that feminism is more harmful than good, is essentially what I was saying. And I think by that definition of equality and equal weight to voices, I'm on board, right? You could call me a feminist if that's what I thought it was, but I don't think that's what it is. I think you mentioned a term of systemic oppression. Is that what you said? Systemic oppression?
Yes. So,
institutional.
Yeah. So there are systems that, and this applies to racism. This applies to, you know, sexual orientation and gender as well. But yeah, there are systems, like, for example, it used to be that only white men were allowed to vote. So that means that, you know, women had to fight in order to get access to vote. And then over the years, it's, you know, in its current form, like, the other thing is, like, I've learned that there are waves of feminism.
Yeah.
Evidently we're in the fourth wave now. I don't know. I don't follow these things a lot, right? So I feel like I'm probably not the best person to talk about feminism, except for, like, I'm learning too.
Absolutely.
But the idea is that you have to kind of exactly what is equality, and then also who is being harmed, right? So if you look at, you know, systemically, women enter into politics way less than men. And it doesn't mean that men are the ones who are systemically oppressing them. I think that's the thing. It's like, I am not being, like, you are not personally doing me harm, right? But the system still exists. The system of women's voices don't matter as much as politics as men's do is an attitude that has been culturally embedded since the very dawn of our country. I mean, you think of the founding fathers, for example, like, you don't think of the women.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, and those are things that when we hear those kind of cultural things, the ones who hear that and go, oh, the founding fathers, and it's like, oh yeah, I should be in politics. Right? Women hear that and go, oh, I shouldn't be in politics. And Abigail Adams, I think, you know, she wrote fervently about don't forget the women, don't forget the women. Like, women were just as important in the revolution as men were, but we don't hear their stories. So some of it has to do with representation, right? Where my very first software conference, I went and I was one of 2 women. And so there is this feeling of, like, I don't belong here.
Yeah, it leads to discomfort. I know what you mean there, and you know, it's speaking of race, right? You know, I've been in places where I was the only person in a basketball gym that wasn't black, and that was very uncomfortable. And you know, and that was a difficult experience. And there was explicit, right? You know, I do not want you on my team because of your skin color, right? So while that's a very much lower stakes kind of encounter than some of the things you're talking about, I have a sense of what it's like to be in that place where, you know, where you are unlike everyone else in some way. And yeah, it's especially when there is hostility from those people there's no question that and I would say, so as far as systemic institutional oppression, I would say there's no question too, something like voting, right? It is granted to men and denied to women. Well, there's no question that that's unjust and silly and should have been a no-brainer to you know, the 18th Amendment? No, the 19th Amendment, right? To make it so that women could vote. I mean, duh, right? That's absolute silliness. So, and you know, when you talk about feminism, right? I think first wave feminism is really about suffrage, right? So, yeah, I'm on board, right? Although I think voting is, it's something that I don't practice, and that's, you know, that's a whole other topic. And I think with these kinds of conversations, it's probably very easy to go down tangents. And I think in one sense that's okay, but to another, I want to come back to feminism, and you know, I still haven't really articulated what I think it means, right? I said what I don't think it means.
Yeah.
So feminism to me is a violation of the 5th habit. Okay, so that's a reference to Stephen Covey's The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, right? It is, you know, the 5th habit is seek first to be understood, and then I said it completely backwards. Seek first to understand, and then to understood. And then to be understood. I'll get it out eventually, right? So I think feminism makes a lot of demands and not requests, demands to be understood without making an offer of reciprocation. And I think that's really kind of my first thing with feminism, right? Instead of saying, I get a lot of attention from men when I walk down the street, it jumps right to harasser, right? And I think instead of saying, you know, I get this attention and I don't like it, right? Would you please not do that to me? It brings forth accusations, right? And I'm painting with broad brushes, of course, because I think that's, you know, when we talk about these terms, that's all we can do. Saying that it's all about equality is also painting with a broad brush. And I think, you know, there are many, many levels of different people with, you know, different ideas about what this is after. But when I you know, when I watch YouTube videos about feminists, what I generally see is a lot of accusation, and and I think, you know, you attract more flies with honey than vinegar. I think, you know, I'm on board with most of the things that feminists are asking for, right? You tell me that you don't want me to tell you that you're beautiful. Okay, you know, I request granted. I understand. You know, courtesy dictates that if that's what you want, that's what you will get, right? If instead you come and say you are a harasser, right? The natural response to that is, no, I'm not. How dare you, right? And the behavior persists as a protest to this unjust accusation.
Yeah.
So
I think it's really interesting. So I think, so for me, you know, when I really understand, and I think if you look at the definition of feminism, it is about equality, right? So to say is really interesting because it's about the power dynamic, right? And I think what I grappled with, where it was like, I don't want, like, I see somebody who uses communication as a way to, like, I'm a big fan of Stephen Covey's, right? Like, and that was one of the first books that I read when I was early in my career, and it made a difference. And so that was part of the reason why I was like, no, I'm not a feminist. I'm not loud like them. I'm not disrespectful like them. And I think one of the challenges is that instead of looking at things in terms of individual interactions, it helps me when I look at things dynamics, right? So in the instance of, you know, woman feels harassed, what she's saying is, I feel harassed. She doesn't know how to articulate that. Like, I feel harassed. And when you make me feel like, when you talk about my beauty in a situation where I'm trying to exert my power, you are taking my power away from me. Right. So I've had that happen where I've been in board meetings, for example, and I've said something, and then somebody has made a comment about my personality or my looks or something about my, you know, my sex, where it then undercuts the value and the power dynamic of my statement. You saw this with recent example with Uber, right? So Ariana Huffington, you know, they were talking about the CEO of Uber, who Travis, who I don't know how you pronounce his last name.
It's spelled,
but yeah, like I can recognize it when it's spelled. But you look at him, and like, so she was going in and saying, here's how we're going to change it. And when you have more women on boards, statistically, they make more profit. So we need to do this. And then there was an investor at the meeting who made a snide remark and said, yeah, and you also have more catfighting or something similar. He used that as a way to undermine her authority and her power. It's not necessarily the, I don't want to call you beautiful, right? Or I don't want to be heard as beautiful. It's, I want you to pay attention to the power dynamics. And when you are in a position of power, are you saying something because you feel threatened and because women are exerting their power or sharing their voice? And the other thing is that I was married before Scott, and that relation was incredibly abusive. I had like physically abusive, lots of verbal abuse and mental abuse and emotional abuse. And I had to be in therapy for a long time, kind of dealing with that. Again, it's about power. You know, it's not about sex. And I think when you look at racism too, there is a lot of intersectionality, which is why women who have maybe gotten a little bit further along need to also lend their voices to other disenfranchised places to help us all. Because I think the goal for everyone is just equality, that if you have a voice, you can share it. And for a long time, share my voice, you know, for a bunch of different reasons. But that's essentially what feminism is do I feel like my voice matters as much as a white man's? And there are many situations where because of things I had to do, like one example is like there's this thing called the confidence gap, where HP did some research on why women weren't applying for executive positions. And it turned out that men will apply for a role, like for a job, if they meet about 60% of the criteria on the application. Women, guess how much?
I guess 25.
100.
Or I mean, yeah. I went the wrong way.
So women won't apply for an application unless they won't apply for a position unless they meet every single one of these things. And that was something I did. Like I would, and this is why you see women who don't want to go into software, because you have to fail. And it's like this fear of failure, and there's all sorts of cultural things that go into it. But again, it's that power dynamic of like, oh my gosh, if I fail, then people are going to see me as not good. And a man can fail,
well,
and it's like, I mean, even in racism, it's like you look at the way the words that people use, so for example, right now, you have teenagers who have been shot and killed by police officers who are being described as thugs, which isn't accurate. They're 12-year-old boys. And then when Donald Trump Jr., who's 39, does something, the media describes him as a kid, right? So it's like they're playing down like, oh, he didn't actually have that much power. He was just a kid. And then with the victims of police violence, it's playing up. Oh, well, they were so dangerous. They were thugs, right? So for me, it's like, it's less about this and that, and it's more about just looking at power dynamics.
Power dynamics. That's interesting. I would question a little bit how universal it is that the teenagers' thuggishness is played up. I don't know that that's not true. I don't know that it is true. I question whether that's really the case. I think that there are a lot of media outlets who have some incentives to try to enhance the narrative of open season on Black youths and things like that. But I don't know enough. I haven't studied deeply on what's true about those things or not. But power is interesting, right? And I wonder, I mean, the investor in the case of Arianna Huffington, right? I mean, that's a position of power where you're coming to me, the investor with I need something from you, right? Being in a position of power there. I don't know that it really has a lot to do with gender. I wonder if sometimes these power dynamics, whether gender or race or any of those kinds of things, whether there's more put on the genders and the relative genders of the people involved rather than money, which of course maybe the acquisition of being in that position of power and all of that money is because of some advantage that this guy had because of his gender or something along those lines, right? I mean, it's a complex and wild thing, but I think people have biases, no question, right? Every single thing that you look at, you are coming with all of your past history, and the human mind is a pattern matching engine, if nothing else, right? I mean, that's what it is more than anything else. And when you see that somebody who has treated me in one way before has some things in common with this person that's sitting in front of me, well, you're going to jump to some conclusions, and that's human. It's natural, and it's I think about that in the world of software, right? When I go to a meetup and I'm told that if I see a woman there and I ask her if she's a programmer, that I've committed an offense. Well, a good 80% of the women that I see at meetups are recruiters, right? And I think it's wondering, is this one of the 2 out of 10 that is actually a programmer? I think I of course I'm going to wonder about that. Now I will try to find out without actually asking that question. So I mean, I've been conditioned that I think back to that thing, right? I've learned that, hey, I don't like that, so don't do it. Well, okay, I won't. But
well,
I think
so I used to get asked that question all the time. Like every meetup I went to, it's like, so do you code? And like, again, that's an example of taking away my power, because how often does Scott get asked that he codes? How often are you asking men if they code?
Well,
Right?
but it's recognizing a pattern, right? I mean, when most of the women that you see at these things are not coders, it's natural to wonder and want to know, who am I dealing with here? And it's not because I don't think you have power. It's because in my experience, a majority of the people that I've interacted with, this is kind of the way it is, right?
And so I think this is a perfect example for us to get like deep into looking at the other person's perspective. So totally get that. And I absolutely hear where you come from, because, I'm always curious too. But my question is, does it matter? Because from my perspective, is the very first question that anybody ever asks me is, do you code? And so when I'm hearing that over and over and over and over again, I'm hearing, you're not really a coder. You're not really a coder. You don't belong here. You don't belong here. And for me, so what I ended up doing, I don't know, but I got a tattoo. So it's a JavaScript function.
Nice.
Basically, it calls back undefined. So it means I can be whatever I want.
I like it.
So now, like when I see people, like no one asks me anymore, because like if you saw this, you're like, oh, well, chances are she's got a code snippet tattooed on her wrist. So I'm guessing she codes, right? And the difference in my perspective from, 6-7 years of being asked, any networking event I went to was the first question out of like, I would go, meet 15, 20 people. I would say 80% of them, the very first question out of their mouth was, so do you code? Of course I code. Why else would I be at this event? Like I'm either coding or I'm learning about coding. Like,
or you're trying to get programmers a job so that you can get your commission.
I mean, there are people, but there are males who are recruiters too.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I threw out a number of 80%, right? And that's totally, made up number. I think it's relative.
But to call back to like maybe your experience where you felt isolated, like you were in the gym, right? And like, what if every single person came up to you and said, do you really play basketball? Do you really play basketball? What are you doing in this gym?
It's not too far from the truth of how I was treated, actually.
That made you feel really uncomfortable, because you're like, I belong here. I want to be here, right? And so that is the feeling that happens, right? Yeah. And then it's like, I don't want to come back. So here's the challenge is that, there's a pattern. And you can be curious about it, but how can we refactor the language that we're using to interact with each other so that we can get the question answered, but in a way that doesn't make the other person feel submissive?
Absolutely. I think that's wonderful, right? And that's exactly the kind of understanding that we need to have, right? When I walk up to a woman and say, hey, do you code, right? My intention is, good intentions, right? My intention is I want to know more about you and let's get to know each other, right? And that message is received in a completely different way. We're speaking different languages altogether. And, I think if the response to that is, oh, you jerk, right? What would I be doing here? That's not going to help me understand why that was something that was insensitive of me to ask. But when you articulate it the way that you just did, right? The scales, I'm bumping in the microphone. The scales fall off my eyes, right? I see something that I didn't see before. And I think if we could have those kinds of interchanges, if that's the way that we approached these kinds of, oh, you're a jerk, no, you're a jerk kind of interactions.
So the question that I use is, what projects are you working on lately?
Nice. That's vague. I like it.
Well, and here's the thing is that it's best to start with open-ended questions.
Yes.
Sales for a living, right? I studied how to have these types of conversations where you're just, I mean, my job was to work a room, right? Like I went to 3 networking events a day. I went to a breakfast meeting, a lunch meetup, and an evening event. And like, I had to shake a lot of hands and hands out a lot of business cards. And so, when you start with an open-end question, you actually get a much better conversation than, so you code? Well, then it's like, okay, now where do we go? But if you start with an open-ended question, like, so what brings you here tonight? Or what projects are you working on lately? Or, when you're not, like sometimes at a conference, I'm like, so when you're not hanging out at a conference with agile folks, what do you like to do? But it just kind of breaks the ice a little bit, and it's a good way to kind of give the other person power and say, I respect and I want to listen to what you have to say. And then throughout the course of the conversation, it'll be evident what they do. If they're a recruiter, right? But you don't have to be as direct and abrupt right at the beginning, because, from my perspective, just as somebody who has received that stuff, it's like, yeah, I get that you're curious, and it's not it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's not one person asking me. It's that every time, like, I go to an event, it's like, yes, I belong here. Yes, I belong here. So
yeah.
So yeah, I think that it's really powerful that you've had an experience that you can draw on, right? And so you can invoke that empathy. And so when you see someone who clearly is feeling, like they don't belong, you can help that person. I know I've been in situations where I feel like the odd man out. No, you've got a friend here, right? Yeah. And just small things like that make a really big difference. So.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that really relates to the harassment dynamic as well, right? I think when I think about my perspective as a male, right, especially a geeky male who I've told you this before, that I've been telling myself this story for a majority of my life, that I'm good at machines, not good at humans. And that really is a self-fulfilling prophecy in a lot of ways. And I've been afraid to talk to girls for a significant portion of my existence. And so, coming from a perspective, the confession that I have to make as well is that I am a sexual creature, right? And sex dominates my thoughts much of the time. And as much as I do not express to women that I encounter that, oh, you're beautiful, or more crudely than that I'm thinking it in my mind, it's there, right? And it's not something I can ignore. It's something that is front and center on my mind, and it's there. And I suspect that most men are like that, but I mean, I don't speak for all men, but that's my experience, is that this overwhelming urge to express these things is constantly there, and it dominates my thoughts. And so from my perspective, when I see a beautiful woman, that is the first thing that I notice, and I have a desire to express that, and I have a desire to try to get close to that woman. And it's overwhelming, it's overpowering, right? I think with now that I'm over 40 years old, it hasn't diminished at all, but my control over it has increased to the point where I can keep it under wraps. But that beast is still there, right? It's just got a leash on it.
Yeah.
But that's my perspective, and it's also the perspective of, hey, I'm a geek, and I don't get a lot of attention from these women from whom I want that attention. And so when, and I'm speaking in the first person, but I think this is much broader than just me, right? When there's a guy on the street who sees a woman that he wants to meet, wants to interact with, wants to enhance both his existence and hers through their interaction, it's only natural for him to want to talk to her, want to approach her, want to tell her about the things that he finds appealing about her. And so I think, to the fifth habit, right? To seek to understand, that is where that man on the street is coming from. And, at the same time, right, that woman, like you said, right, it's those repeated interactions that are the same thing over and over again, right? This woman who gets a lot more attention that she wants, and who, not only, does she have these interactions with people, but she's also maybe, right? I'm trying to exercise some cognitive empathy and put myself in those shoes, right? You're dealing with someone who is bigger and stronger and able to overpower you if they so chose, right? So, I think understanding is key, and I think it needs to go both ways, right? And I think that's the thing that feminism forgets, is trying to understand the perspective of the other person.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the interesting things. Like, as I've dug into feminism ideas a little bit more, and kind of the research and the theories behind it, one of the biggest things is that we have to work with men. It's not about being better than men. And so there's actually a lot of conversations, although they're not as loud, that it's like, no, we have to understand what men are going through, because we're in this together. We're not going to get to equality without everybody understanding. And so it's about having those conversations, because and I think you hit on it exactly, right? Like, for me, one of the things is like I've gained a lot of weight after the kids. And I've noticed, like kind of similar to the tattoo, I get very less attention. I get way less attention now that I'm overweight. And part of me is like, I really don't want to lose weight because it's nice just to go to a conference and have people not be sexually attracted to me.
No kidding. Like, wow.
I'm serious. And so it's like, again, it's pervasive. And it's like, when that's the first thing, it's, if I feel objectified, I feel like you don't actually want to talk to me as a person. You just want to, you know, you're looking at me as an object. You're not looking at me as a complete human person. You know, you're not talking to me about my ideas. And so there are different ways that women do that. Like some women will just take themselves out of that situation. And so I think that's part of why women don't go to conferences, or they avoid a hyper masculine environment, right? So if you've got kind of the bro-grammer culture, women just opt out, you know, or they get angry, you know? And so, you know, there is this feeling of like, no, you won't treat me this way. My voice matters, right? And I remember feeling very much like, it's like, you know, I have kids now, I have a 4-year-old, and it's like, he's just throwing a tantrum because he wants to be heard. And I feel like that's feel sometimes is, you know, listen to me, please listen to me, I care. It's necessarily that feminists don't want to understand, but they feel very much that they are in a position where they are submissive, and they are, their power is being taken away. And so they don't feel like they really can't say anything. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's a powerful statement, right? Saying that I don't want to return my body to the condition it was before because it came with all of this other stuff. That's wow, right? How extreme is this? That is, I didn't realize that. So, you know, that's,
yeah. I mean, I think it's normal. Like I know a lot of people who are this way. And like, you see this too, like when I was talking to a woman about, getting, oh, my phone's ringing, sorry. But I was talking to somebody at a conference saying, you know, I want to get my hair colored. Like, and, you know, she had this beautiful, like green and blue hair. And she's like, oh, you totally should. Cause then guys actually talk to you. They don't see you as an object. It's a signal that like, you're one of them, and they don't see you as like one of the marketing people. And so you don't get asked about being a recruiter. They know that you're technical, like. And so there are these kind of like physical things. I'm like, well, I don't know if I really want to do that. I kind of like the way I look, but it does come down to that. Like if I change the way I look, then people interact with me differently. So
interesting. Wow. That's remarkable. That's more extreme than I would have pictured. So I think that opened my eyes a bit. I want to, so a couple things that you mentioned, objectification and submission. I want to get to both of those, right? So the object thing, right? Seeing someone as an object of sexual desire is not necessarily mutually exclusive with valuing their ideas. In fact, I mean, that is the very ideal of marriage, right? That you have a sex partner as well as a life partner, right? And that you are intertwined in all of these different ways. And I guess, you know, my preoccupation with sex, I think is I can understand how it comes across as being the only thing that a man is thinking about. But why is that mutually exclusive? Why? Well, and I guess my other example, right, is that if I go into, you know, if I go into a Starbucks, right, and I treat the person behind the cash register as merely a device that exchanges money for bad coffee, all right, then, you know, isn't that the same thing?
I think it's the difference between transactional versus building a relationship. Because in the example of Starbucks, that's a transaction, right? And so I'm playing this role, like this is a moment in time where we are exchanging a few words so that I can get my coffee and they can have this person in line. When you're talking about somebody who's a coworker, or when you're talking to somebody who you're interested in, you know, I know for me personally, one of the things that actually attracted me the most to Scott was that he such a feminist. Like he's all about consent, and he is so willing to put his own feelings like on a shelf. I'm okay. And like for me, coming from a place where I was in a relationship where I had a lot of abuse, this was really attractive to me because I felt very safe. And so when I had dates and things before I started dating Scott, it would be, you know, a lot of it was about my looks. A lot of it was about what people wanted to do with me. And I felt very unsafe because my past experiences, you know, like one of the things that I heard recently on a very conservative radio was that if you want to end domestic violence, all you need to do is enforce marriage. And you clearly don't understand, because my experience of domestic violence happened within marriage. And it took me going to therapy and really understanding really how bad it was, right? And so again, that it's that power. It's coming from this place of genuine fear. You know, like when I was in college, for example, I dated a guy who we dated for 3 months, and then I went to visit him on his campus, which was like an hour away. We went to different schools, and you know, this is somebody that I trusted. Like we had gone on many, many dates, and he drugged me.
Oh man. Because
we were as friends. And at the time I was like, I'm saving myself for marriage and everything. So I blacked out. I remember waking up, like throwing up, him going, I really fucked up. Like and he was trying to impress all of his friends. And that I don't know what happened that night. Recollection and no memory. So when a man comes up to me and exploits or positions himself in a place of power and talks to me about, you know, me being an object of his sexual fantasies, I go to, I don't know if I was raped or not, because I have no memory of it. If I was, I have no evidence, so the police won't help me on it. You know, I have marriage where it's like, if I was confrontational, right, like things went bad really fast. So there is a genuine fear for my personal safety at the mention of that. So just something that comes across from your point of view as being very innocent conjures up all of these feelings, and it's incredibly triggering for me. And so then what happens is I just retreat, right? I you know, kind of don't have as much of a relationship, or I'm not as willing to be as open or forthcoming, you know? And I know for me, like one of the things with Scott was like he always makes sure that he reaffirms that my feelings are very valid, and like, you know, he's very sensitive on that. And to me, that's, and it's hard to keep these things under control. I think it's hard for women to, you know, because we're always in the place of like, where can I, like, am I going to be taken seriously? But yeah, so those are some of my personal perspectives. And I know from talking to most of my friends who are women, it's very common. It's very, very common. I mean, the statistics are like 1 in 3 women has experienced sexual assault. You know, I'll go to an event, and I mean, it's not just words. Like, I mean, people will grab you in places that you don't want them to. And a lot of times it's to take your power away. And so when someone says that has not been invited, right? And it's like in a business context, then it feels threatening, right? If it's on a first date, or if it's on, like, yeah, okay, but it's within the context of, okay, this might lead to a sexual relationship, right? But if it's in a context of a business setting where it's clearly inappropriate, it puts you at the point where you feel like you're not able to fully express yourself. And it does reinforce that kind of dominant submissive relationship.
That goes a long way to express understanding, right? I mean, that's an emotional story. I'm sorry that you've gone through those things. I've never been through anything like that, and I don't know what it's like, but my goodness, I I can imagine how traumatic and awful that must be. I don't know about the statistics, right? You know, I've heard these numbers of sexual assault, and I've heard other people saying, no, that's nonsense. It's not even close to that. And I don't know who to believe. But regardless, right? Anybody being a victim of sexual assault is, it's a travesty. It's a tragedy. And man, it's, and so, you know, understand that there are people who have had experiences like that, and that is called to mind when someone expresses, hey, you know, I find you attractive, right? Which seems innocent to me, like you said. Yeah, it's a completely different perspective, and we need to understand.
Yeah, and so I think that comes back around to politics too. Like I remember when there was the hot mic incident with Donald Trump, I had to a couple of days off, and it's been really difficult for me because like I know that this person who like there is evidence of him talking about and bragging about taking advantage of women in a way that I was taken advantage of. And that person is now in a position of lots of power, which is why now it's like, I'm starting to feel more comfortable because more women are talking. Like I think women tend to feel more comfortable when they're in groups. Like we're really good at collaborating. I considered running for office myself and then just decided I really don't want to. But I have a really, really good friend and she's running. And so now I get to help her, and that helps me feel empowered, right? Like, yeah, these things happen to me and I'm going to work really hard to make sure that there are policies in place that protect women, because, and it's not that I think men are actively trying to, it's just that you don't have this experience, right? If you've never been in this experience, you don't know how vulnerable it is and how awful it is to, you know, go through all of these things and say, look, this happened to me, and then be completely dismissed or not have protection or, you know, things like that. So, or like, you know, what would have happened if that person had taken advantage of me and then I ended up pregnant, you know, and then I would have had to take care of, you know, a child that I didn't want, you know, or I wasn't the right time. I was a freshman in college, right? So
yeah, enormous irreversible consequences.
Yeah. And so for me, like I went to my school and I was like, I don't know what happened. And I got I got one of the Plan B pills, and, you know, who knows, but, you know, I was able to kind of proceed with my life as normal. But I know a lot of women who have gotten abortions. I know a lot of women who have, you know, who have had to take advantage of things like that. And it is literally saved their lives in so many ways, because, you know, that man would have just gone on like nothing had happened, you know, and it would have had severe consequence for me. And now it's like I have 2 children that I absolutely love. They are in a happy relation. You know, I'm in a happy relationship. Like they are the right children to have. And like, I chose that, you know, but the challenge is that, you know, if you don't have systems set up to protect the people who are vulnerable. And I think the first step is the people in power. You're doing is incredibly powerful. Like, because what you're doing is you're saying, Andrea, your experiences are valid. That is huge. That is huge, huge, huge. And that's the first step in any kind of change, is just saying, I recognize that you went through these experiences and that you've come to your, you know, opinions based on those experiences. And I want to hear more, right? I want to understand more. And that's how we build consensus. And that's how we're able to shift power dynamics so that we can tilt it towards equality.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that people having enormous power is the problem in and of itself, right? As I've alluded to before. But you know, my initial reaction, and well, I guess I'd still say that I think something along these lines to hearing the grab them by the pussy tape, right, was you're talking about, you know, it kept getting raised that this was sexual assault that he was talking about. And I said, well, I mean, it's explicit on the tape in there, right? He says, they let me do it, right? Isn't it that's explicit, right? What you are saying that he says that they don't let me do it when he explicitly says they let me do it. And I guess to an extent, I will stand by that and say that it's not necessarily an admission of sexual assault, but I think there's more nuance than that, right? And I think for someone to take that as a threatening kind of a statement, I understand, right? I mean, there's no one right interpretation, and your experience is going to color how you take these things, of course.
Yeah, yeah, and some of it's like, it depends on, it depends. So, you can look at the same situation and it's very different from the perpetrator's point of view and the victim's point of view, right? So, and we'll define perpetrator and victim purposely in a gender neutral way, because women can be perpetrators just as much as men, right? Certainly. And men can be victims just as much as women. And so that really goes to more of the power dynamic, right? And that's really what we're explaining here. In that situation with the hot mic, he was bragging about his bravado and how women don't put up much resistance, right? And so from the perpetrator's point of view, it's, well, she didn't fight back. She didn't smack me away. And the challenge is that when you do that, there are some men who see that as a challenge, and then they want that more, and they will continue to pursue you and pursue you and pursue you and pursue you. And it's like, it's draining. It's mentally draining, right? And then from the victim's point of view, it's like, I shouldn't have to fight back, defend myself against this. This is inappropriate, right? I should be treated as a full person who's not a sexual object, and I have consent and I have control over an agency over my body. And if you want to engage with me, you need to ask for permission from me. And so for me, that's where I stand, in the place of the victim. And I've been in situations where men, this to me, but where men have on many occasions just grabbed me. And so it's like, yeah, that's what they do. They don't ask for permission. And from their perspective, I probably let them because I was walking by, or because I was, I smiled. And it's like,
they let me do it is open to interpretation as far as what that means, very much. And it's not at all unnatural or wrong to take it as what you said, right? A lack of resistance rather than consent. And so, I think,
and that's why I think it comes back down to power dynamics, because I think women, Scott was in a relationship before me, and, the woman that he was married to was incredibly manipulative, right? And a lot of power dynamics within that relationship. So I think women can be, and here's the other thing is that when, like, I've seen, videos just like the, kind of walking on a street, like the woman walking down the street, nobody, kind of notices all the cat calls. I've seen other videos where there's a woman who's being verbally and physically abusive to the person that she's with, and no one does anything.
Yeah.
So I think it goes both ways, right?
It does. Well, and I think there's also a perception that the man should be able to take care of himself, right? Whereas, the woman may need rescuing, which may or may not be the case. I mean, there's a lot of different situations. I think there is something to be said for, if you are a woman and you're in a situation where somebody is trying to pressure you into something that you don't want to do, you need to have enough confidence in yourself to say no to that. And I hope that my daughters, I don't only hope, I'm actively trying to instill confidence in my daughters to the point where, that is how they will respond. They will firmly say no. And I think that takes away some of the ambiguity. Now that's not the full answer, right? I mean, there is such a thing as, pushing things beyond the boundaries, where even without an explicit no. And there's a significant gray area where there's a lot of interpretation.
One of the things that we do at our house is, like, we use tickling. Like, everybody tickles, and as a way to honor boundaries and demonstrate that no means no. Like, when in my family, it was kind of like I would say no, and then they would tickle harder and like keep going.
Yeah.
Small, I think, generational thing that was conditioning to show me that no one was really going to listen to what I had to say. And if I said no, it was going to get worse. It was going to get worse. And so when I ended up in a relationship, and that was very much the case.
Ouch.
Right. Yeah. So now it's like with our kids, like, we use tickling, for example, and it's just like, and they're like, stop. And so we stop right away.
Oh, I love it.
And they're like, keep going.
It starts,
we're like, okay.
It starts with parenting. Yes. treat
It
your
really
children.
does. And it's
Yes.
teaching your kids about consent, right?
Yeah.
And like I have boundaries. Like my daughter loves to snuggle. Oh my gosh, she is such a snuggle bug. And I love that. But one of the things is that she loves to snuggle when I'm eating. So we have, and she's 2. So we're like down, and when you have to ask to snuggle with mommy. It's taken a lot of training, but it's like, it starts there. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's more of like, because my dad raised me very much to be like didn't say what I want. And there were kind of these mixed signals, because then it was like, but when I do say what I want, I don't know. So there are some things that are really more subtle, I would say,
Yeah.
and less overt, that aware of, just because Scott and I have both, experienced our own forms of abuse, and we're probably hyper aware, which means, who knows, we're probably messing up our kids in a bajillion other ways, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, to your point, it starts with just listening and trying to understand. And so I'm interested too, like, so what are some of what are some of the things that I can do to kind of help you, make you feel more comfortable, or like what are some of the things that you struggle with that
I don't know. I feel pretty I feel pretty confident and assured in my person, as far as interactions in my daily life. I think the idea, though, of expressing my opinions, right, to say the things that I've said, right, and I mean, for me to have said that the open mic tape, that I was not taken aback by that, to say that out loud, and you didn't call me an asshole because of it. I think that's a big deal, right? Because I think a lot of people would have reacted very differently to that statement. And I don't know, you may have harbored some sentiment of that, perhaps, but I don't know. It's
well, I think part of it is well, I think on my Facebook page, for example, when politics got really loud on Facebook right before the election, and really kind of last year altogether, my thing was like, I want to make sure everybody feels respected, right? Because I believe that everybody's opinions are valid, and even those that I disagree with. I kind of just set some ground rules. And so I go to a Unitarian Universalist church. And so there's a bunch of principles that are part of that practice. And the first one is the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And so it's recognizing that, yeah, everybody comes to their own realization. You have to understand first. Like, I get it. Like, I totally get where you're coming from. And like, that has to be really frustrating to hear, like, to have this feeling. Like, I don't think about sex unless I'm like in a sexual mood, right? Like, it doesn't distract me from my day-to-day work.
Yeah.
Rarely. Right. Like maybe, right. Something like that. But like and I would say that, like, in talking to most of my friends who are women, it's like, that's kind of on average. Like, it's just not something that takes up a lot of brain space. Like, we can focus on it, but it's just not, it doesn't dominate our thought process or feel like a distraction. So I can imagine, like, I feel distracted by a lot of things, like that mental load that we talked about. And if I take that feeling of being overwhelmed by my mental load and replace that with thoughts of, like, I've been in an office environment where there was someone who was like, looked like a Greek god. And it was like, every time that person entered into the room, I was like, whoa, like really taken aback. And it was like, I had to really suppress my thoughts, and it was very distracting. So I imagine that if that's happening to you on a regular basis, that has to suck.
Yeah.
that's kind of really
so let me tell you this, right? It doesn't even necessarily have to be what I would consider an attractive woman. If I see a woman in either a dress or skirt and heels, it's game over. I'm not thinking about anything else.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, like, we all have our own practices, right? So, for it's about kind of self-control at that point.
Yeah.
And like, he really comes in. It's like, okay, this is somebody that I want to have a relationship with. It's not a transaction.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Well, it
So
helps
if
too
I'm
that
going
I'm
to get,
married and I'm not actually trying to get involved with
there
anybody.
you go.
I mean, that makes a big difference
Right,
to the
right.
thing as well. But yeah. So
Yeah. Yeah. But also just like recognizing like, okay, here are all the different reasons why. And then your rational brain kicks in, right? That's why it's the cognitive empathy. Like, okay,
yeah.
in addition to here are all the risks, like it's paying attention and putting ourselves in a place where our beautiful frontal lobe can take over from the animal part of our brain and say, you know, okay,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
I recognize you, I hear you, sexual desire, or, you know, for me it's the amygdala. Like I get fear, you know, I have fight or flight to the extreme. You know, because of my trauma, I'm actually on medication to help me regulate the amount of norepinephrine that gets released, because otherwise I'll be in fight or flight, like in just like in a constant state of panic. And so to deal with our own demons in our own ways, you know. And I think that it starts with just being able to just talk about it and say, we've got way more in common than we do differently, and
Yeah.
being able to just have conversations like this. So I am so proud of you. I think I'm so honored to be the first person on the show to have this kind of conversation, because I think what you're doing, this is so needed.
Yes.
And this is what will change the world.
I think so.
This is how we fight back.
Yeah, I think it's pretentious to
Yeah.
say that I'm going to change the world, but yes, this is the template for what we need to do. Yes, yes, of course. I think, you know, the conclusion that I'm coming to here is that we differ only in two things: a definition of what feminism means, as far as the topic of feminism goes, and a perspective on how to take certain events. And I think that's it, right? Otherwise, I think, you know, by principle, you and I think the same things.
I agree. And I remember when I told you, I was like, I don't know, we may have a lot more in common than you think.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, well, I didn't really even
I would
know.
agree. And I think, yeah. And I think, you know, you get to know people more and more. And as you continue to have these conversations, you learn more and more about different people, more and more about how people can change, you know, their opinions and change their minds. So yeah.
Let me say one more thing and get your reaction about something that I find off-putting about feminism.
Yeah.
So and it's related, right? When you talked about that Scott's former marriage was abusive and a manipulative spouse, I've got to take that with a grain of salt, right? Because I mean, I don't know, right? And I'm hearing, you know, through the grapevine about this other person, and I'm not going to make any judgments about this person without, you know, without better evidence about the thing, right? Feminism, or at least some portion of feminists, state that if there is an accusation of sexual assault, that it should be automatically believed. Right. And I don't necessarily take opposition to that. I think I would say, well, it's got to be context sensitive, right? If you're talking about your best friend is saying that someone sexually assaulted her or him, then yeah, right. In that context, being the shoulder to cry on, being the sympathetic and or empathetic ear to help them through that situation, of course, that is exactly what you should do. And, you know, believe them. Yes, yeah, why not, right? I mean, unless you know them to be somebody who would do something like this in an untrustworthy way, in which case, why are they your best friend? All of that kind of stuff, right? In a context where you are on a jury and you have the life of the accused in your hands, well, believing the accusation without reservation, that is an entirely different matter. And I think
yeah, well, I think you need evidence, right? Like,
yeah.
But and that's, you know, and that's where it can be really challenging. So I think for me, what I care about is not that they're automatically believed, but they're automatically taken seriously, or that there is a way have a conversation. Because I think at too many organizations, it is this idea of, well, we're just not going to even listen to it. And I think this is what happens with companies like Uber, where it's like you know, or Fox News, where it's like there's this submission of we're we're going to pay you off. Like, we're not going to even address this. You know, I think this comes into policies such as, you know, forced arbitration, where it's like, you can't even go to court to talk about this kind of stuff. Or, you know, it's making sure that whoever is in the position of the victim has a voice to complain and has a way to get some kind of retribution. Now, what does the policy look like around that? To argue it, but I think on a fundamental level, it's hard for me to think that we would equality if we are constantly squashing the voices of victims and immediately disbelieving them. So I think it's not necessarily about belief, but it's saying, okay, let's realize that more women actually don't come forward. Like, I never came forward about my assault ever. Like, I didn't even know that it was assault until like 10 years later when I saw a video, and I was like, oh my God, that's what happened to me. I was drugged. Makes sense. Couldn't even put it all together because of the trauma. And recognizing that is part of it too. And that, like, looking at the evidence and looking at the science and looking at, you know, all of the different things. But I think, you know, one of the best things was that when I started going to therapy, you know, like, I had domestic violence counselors, and I had people who kind of went with me through this journey and who could help me kind of navigate the system. So it doesn't always necessarily have to be jury or things like that. But I think culture where that's not okay, you will be found out, like, there's evidence, right? And I think that's kind of what you're seeing now. But that women can come forward without being ashamed or afraid. Because what happens now is that, like, a woman will come forward and it's immediately, well, you're a whore, or you did this. And it's like, no, it's actually, it takes a lot of courage to come forward.
Yeah.
So
it does take a lot of courage to come forward. Yeah. And, you know, I think we hit it there, right? I mean, that's exactly it. What really is needed is some human decency, both for victims and the accused, right? And I think that's where the two sides, right? I like to say that there are not two sides to any issue, and I'm not on either side of this thing, right? The people who are saying, no, you can't automatically believe the accuser because that means that you're automatically not believing the accused, right? But you know, you're both wrong and you're both right, right? You know, support
I think this is where empathy comes in, because what empathy helps you do is with perspective taking. And so you can actually hold multiple perspectives in your mind, and that's where the judgment comes from, right? It doesn't come from one place full of resentment. You know, it's looking at it with more of a, you know, rational kind of point of view. Oh, did you freeze? Am I being seen?
It looks like I just had an outage of my internet connection altogether.
Oh no! Well, I stayed on, so I droned on for a little bit, and then I was kind of like, I don't know what to say.
Yeah, I was thinking for a moment that it was you that I lost, but no, it was me. I was gone. I've had a couple of drops recently. I think I'm gonna have to get the cable company out to look at this.
Yeah. So net neutrality, man.
Yeah.
That's what's important.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we won't be able to do videos conferences very much anymore. So.
Yeah. So you probably said all you had to say there about empathy, and I just missed a lot of it. But so
just talking about how it helps you take multiple perspectives, and so then that way it's you can hold two perspectives in your mind at the same time before you come to a judgment. And I think that that's really important. And that's what I always tried to do when I was moderating my Facebook page. And I actually had people come to, like, email me, like Facebook message me while I, and they were like, thank you for just creating a space where we can have respectful dialogue about difficult topics, because, and I was like, I won't tolerate name calling. I won't, these are kind of the ground rules, and we can sure hash out ideas, and you can be passionate, but here. And so I think it comes down to things like trust and listening and, those people skills that you have quite a few of.
I love hearing that. So, I want to say too that there's apparently this thing called the men's rights activist movement, right? That assert that no, it is not women who are oppressed; it is in fact men, right? And I would say the same thing about them that I would say about feminism. That movement, while it has a lot of good points, and there are a lot of ways that men get the short end of the stick in a lot of things, it is also a violation of the fifth habit. It is also full of accusation and vitriol, and it is also, not necessarily extending an offer to understand. So I want to make sure that lest anyone think that's where I land, right? Like so many things, right? Republican and Democrat, no, thank you. I'm not either one of those things.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way. I always want to feel free to choose and change my mind. Like, I know I went to .NET. I still get and they had the survey to kind of to get to know you, so that they could shirt size and stuff like that. And one of them was, and it had like software developer, this and that. And then one was, don't put me in your silly little boxes. And I was like, yes, that is like, can every single form or every single opinion that I ever take now be that? Because that's where I am. I'm like, I want to form my own opinion and figure out where I land. And it's always going to change. Like, I grew up really conservative. Now I probably lean, I'm supporting a Democratic candidate, and my parents are really angry about it. I'm like, well, this is where I think things need to go, and it could skew the other way, and who knows? But like, for me, it's important that I stay open-minded, that I look at evidence, that I am able to take multiple perspectives and then form my own opinion rather than kind of following the herd.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, and I think that's a part of why I don't like people having power over me, right? The thing about government is they take your money and you have no say in it. They decide how much of your money that they get. They don't necessarily serve you. And, if you decide that you are not going to pay them because their service is not what you signed up for, they lock you in a cage with some of the lowest of humanity, some of the depravity which, by the way, when we talk about sexual assault, right? I think, having never walked into a prison yard for the first time, I still can imagine what it's like, and I think that's my closest way of trying to understand what it's like for a woman walking down the streets facing some of the things that they face. That's kind of the way I see government, right? I really, yes, I can vote for somebody who has a 3% chance of actually representing the things that they say that they represent, and I really effectively have no say whatsoever in the whole thing.
Yeah, I used to feel that way too, like, growing up in very much of like, the government just wants to take advantage. Has changed actually significantly because of the Affordable Care Act, for example. My life turned around because I have, trauma as a pre-existing condition. And so that's manifested itself. So I could never get insurance on the individual market, period. And Scott had some medical additions. Yeah.
Okay.
So when the Affordable Care Act came around, that meant that we could leave our corporate jobs and start Corgi Bites. Like, exist without the Affordable Care Act, period. Yeah, so seeing that, it's like, and then also, like, I was able to have kids. Like, I wouldn't have been able to pay for a pregnancy and a successful birth out of out of my pocket. So too many women pre-ACA had to go back and get a corporate job to have kids. And now it's like you can be both an entrepreneur and have children. There were a lot of really good things that came out of that act. So I remember like we had hired like 2 or 3 employees. Obama was still in office. Letter writer, because I was like, I felt very disconnected. And so I wrote a letter to just the Obama administration, just on the White House. And I was like, hey, thanks for passing this legislation. Like, I was able to start a business and now I have a family and like I never had to lose health insurance. This has made a big difference in my life. And now we have 12 employees and I feel like we're contributing to the economy in a very meaningful way. So thanks for this legislation. It meant a lot. And when he was kind of going out of office, I got a email saying, we would never share, like basically the White House would never share your story on your behalf, but there are, organizations out there who are collecting stories like these. So we would encourage you to share them. So I sent stuff around and then I ended up getting invited to a roundtable with my senator.
Wow.
And so he was really interested in learning more about the Affordable Care Act. This is Senator Warner, who I mentioned earlier. And from there, like, he took my story and he shared it on the Senate floor. And that all came back from me taking a small action of just writing a thank you letter. And I used to think that none of those little acts matter. And now, like, I'm going to make a comment on the FCC website because I care about net neutrality. And I'm going to call my representative and I'm going to make sure that they know how I feel. And it's scary, but I feel like one of the nice things that we sometimes take for granted, I know I did up until recently, is that this is democracy, which means that, you can participate, which is a blessing and a curse, because not always going to like what people have to say, but you can rally around people that you do like their ideas and you can help get that person elected. Doesn't mean it's always going to happen, but at least you have a voice and a choice. And so that's one of the ways that I felt good is I didn't I used to just sit there and listen to the radio and feel like, oh, I don't have any power. I feel like I don't have a lot of power. I do something about it. Like I try to offset that feeling by doing something proactive. So I'll write a letter or, get on stage or talk about it or something like that. And that's helped me. And so my position of government has some of the people who are participating is much more that they're folks and they're trying to do the right things. But yet everybody's human and, there's still there's still, self-interest and, staying informed and making sure that, there's political pressure and saying we will vote you out if you don't support this. And so in a way, I feel like, a lot of my friends are way more engaged than they used to be. I know I am. I used to sit around and we used to have book clubs, and now kind of all the people in my book clubs are like historic congressmen. So it's been neat and it feels empowering. So
you felt heard, you felt empowered, and that's pretty cool. And the legislation benefited you too, which was a catalyst in the whole story, being something that mattered. I've never had an experience like that, but I've never written a letter saying thank you for legislation. Of course, I've never really felt like, hey, this legislation really benefited me. And my experience of the Affordable Care Act was very much the opposite, which is interesting considering that I had a bias against it going in, and then I had a negative experience, which may not be completely unrelated. At the same time, I had an experience where I was independent, software consultant and contractor, and buying my own insurance, and bought insurance through the exchange. And there was a mix-up between the exchange and the insurance company, and my automatic payments that I thought had been being made didn't get made, and my policy got canceled before I was even notified that, hey, there's a payment you need to make, right? And then when I tried to call the insurance company to get it straightened out, they told me, well, you have to go talk to the exchange. And when I went to talk to the exchange, they said, no, you have to talk to the insurance company. And ultimately, I was in a situation where the law said that I couldn't buy insurance because I didn't have a policy. And so I had to basically go to the end of the year without insurance at all. And that was the consequence of the legislation for me. So yeah, it's a very different experience. And I don't know, would I have had that experience if I wasn't already kind of, embattled against the legislation anyway? I don't know. But, I think the Affordable Care Act did benefit people. And your story is certainly awesome. And the things that enabled, that's fantastic. And I love it. And, and it hurt people too, right? And I think that's kind of my objection to government, is that it's kind of help some at the expense of others. And, I think that hurts. It's ultimately, who has more power, right? It's that game of power that you were talking about. And it's really a question of who's better at playing the game. You feel empowered, right? That you are able to make a contribution and to put some pressure on these people. And maybe I just haven't been active enough to have experienced that. But I don't feel that at all.
Yeah. It's scary, like when you first start, and it feels weird, like any kind of habit, and like trying something new.
Yeah,
so
totally.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have accomplished what we wanted to here, right? We talked about a lot of deep stuff that matters, right?
Yeah.
And we have demonstrated that we can both agree and disagree, and in a spirit of brotherhood's not the right word, right? Is there a gender neutral form of whatever it is, right? We're united, and it's good.
I would say, our common humanity, maybe.
Exactly. That's it. I like it. Very good.
So
yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really nice. And I can't wait to, listen in on other conversations. Cause like I said, this is a really needed topic, and just being able to explore kind of, something from a different point of view. And it's not necessarily like you're trying to debate. I feel like what I liked about this was, it was just like, we're just going to respect each other's opinions and talk about perspectives. And
yeah, that
might change mine.
Yeah. In the episode 0 that I did to kind of describe what this thing is, that was just me talking about the show itself, I said exactly that. This is not a debate. So when you say that you debated somebody, the first question out of anybody's mouth is, who won? And that's not at all what I want here.
Yeah.
I think, talking to you is an educational experience. And
back to Stephen Covey, it's a win-win, right?
Heck yeah.
Because I feel like I've gotten something out of it. You feel like you've gotten something out of it. Hopefully, maybe the listeners have gotten something out of it. So I think,
I forgot about it. I wanted to ask you another thing about your snuggly daughter, right?
Yes.
Have you read Gary Chapman, The 5 Love Languages?
Yes, yeah, I have. Yeah.
That book
definitely
made
a people touch.
Yes, yeah. It made such a difference to my marriage, because my wife and I are completely different on the ways that we express love, and it led to a lot of feeling rejected between the two of us.
Yeah.
Big difference. So.
Yeah, same with Scott and I give through words of affirmation, and I receive through acts of service. And like, I know Scott and I, it was like almost like when we rank the 5, they were the opposite of each one. So Scott is gift. That's his best one. And I am somebody, like when I lived on my own, I had no furniture in my apartment. I'm very much a minimalist.
Yeah.
And so I really struggle with the gifts part. But yeah, I think just knowing what's important to the other person is really important.
Yeah, I'm physical touch, and I have that same daughter, right? That she is very much a snuggler, and we are just, it's perfect. So, that we fit like a glove. And yeah, my wife is the gift one. And so, it was, for much of our marriage, when she would buy me something and was very proud of herself, showing how much she cared, I was like, really? You spent money on that? And that was not the right response. And, and
it's always a learning process.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So, but anyway,
Awesome.
I wanted to ask
so
you
much.
that, but thank you too. Yeah.
This is great. Thank you so much for having me on the show. This is great, and I'll look forward to future episodes.
Yeah, me too.